Okay. So, hello everyone. Good morning. Really, what I want to do is just learn through the Rishonim on the sugya. I remind you again that we have our Mishnah. We're for now just focusing on Rav Yehuda's view, who for some reason or other learns the Mishnah as only talking about when it says Kurnos, it means a particular Kurnos, a Kurnos Egozim, and he therefore learns our Mishnah as holding Dova Shemelachto LeIssur. If it's a Keli Shemelachto LeIssur, then afilu l'tzorech it's asa. This textually seems a slightly more difficult reading the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says a hammer, and he says it only means a nut cracking hammer, but a regular hammer of a blacksmith not. Because a Keli, the Mishnah, when it says that you can be metaltal it, must be talking about Keli Shemelachto LeHeta, because a Keli Shemelachto LeIssur can't be moved l'tzorech, such as the view of Rabbi Yehuda. The Rishonim draw our attention to the necessity to learn the Mishnah on Kuf Kaf Gimel on the base, in which you see the view of Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi says Kol HaKelim Natalim. The Masechet Shabbat. The Masechet Shabbat and the Masechet Shel will call for our purposes Klisha a Muktza kiss, or to put that in different terminologies, the basis of allowing Klisha melachot LeIssur for any use, even though it's a Klisha melachot LeIssur, is because at the end of the day it's a Kli and all kelim are made for any use. Whereas if you have a Kli, which we call nowadays a Muktza kiss, but basically is another way of saying a Kli, that the yichud of the Kli, the dedication of the Kli, is so specific that you wouldn't use it for any other use, there it's not controversial to say that it would be Muktza for other uses. In other words, Kli Shemelachto LeHeta allowed to be used for any use. Kli Shemelachto LeIssur, that's the machlokus of Rabbi Yehuda, and let's say Rabbi for now. Rabbi Yehuda says this Kli Shemelachto LeIssur is set aside to be used for Issur, you can't therefore use it. And the cholek, the svara against Rabbi Yehuda, would be because at the end of the day it's a Kli and kelim are made for any use. However, everyone would agree that there's a specific type of Kli Shemelachto LeIssur, which we call Muktza kiss, which is a Kli which is so dedicated to its Issur use that contradicts its use for anything else, and there everyone would agree that it's Muktza and you can't use it for something else. The reason we label this as Muktza kiss is because it's a convenience example of why you wouldn't use something for anything else, something which is so valuable and so delicate that a hammer, the svara of those who argue on Rabbi Yehuda says Kli Shemelachto LeIssur, a blacksmith hammer. Why on earth should we be able to use it for cracking nuts on Shabbos? The Cholkim say a Kli is a Kli is a Kli. A Kli is made for use, and therefore, even though it's Muktza for its own use, but if you're using it for a Muktza use, it's still made for that use. And Rabbi Yehuda argues, but something that isn't a hammer, but a delicate artifact, a valuable crystal vase that you just leave sitting on a shelf and you wouldn't use for anything else, is not made for using as a spare mug at your meal if you run out of cups, because it's so delicate. It's a yichud, and therefore the first mission that we need to look at is, I'll come to in a moment, Gary, is Kuf Kaf Gimel on the base, in which Rabbi Yossi says Kol HaKelim Natalim Chutz Min HaMasechet Gadol, in which Rabbi Yossi seems to say Kol HaKelim Natalim. What could be clearer than that? So the first question that we're showing to discuss is how this Mishnah fits with Rabbi Yehuda's reading of the Tanna Kamma. And related to that are assorted questions. Which sort of kelim is he talking about? For which reasons are they nittel? So even though Rav Yossi says it's a very generic statement, Kol HaKelim Natalim, there's a lot of questions we would want to ask about it, which are triggered by how does this fit Rabbi Yehuda, but in more detail would be what of Kol HaKelim? Does it really mean all kelim or only certain types of kelim? And what can they be nittel for? Then the next Mishnah that the Rishonim draw our interest in, and then I'll come to Gary, is Mishnah Kuf Kaf Daled Amud Aleph, in which it says Kol HaKelim Nitalim L'Tzorech V'Shelo L'Tzorech, and then it brings Rav Nechemia, who we're not going to go into now, the third view that's floating around over here. That's Rav Yehuda, Rabbah, and Rav Nechemia in our sugya. But all that the Mishnah says is Kol HaKelim Nitalim. So again, all kelim not telling. The tzorech is shelo l'tzorech, for tzorech, not for tzorech. What does this term mean? The tzorech or not the tzorech? What does kol hakelim mean? What does it mean? All the kelim. And again, does it fit Rabbi Yehuda's view, or how does it fit Rabbi Yehuda's view? These are the topics that the Rishonim discuss, and that's really what we're going to spend our time looking at. And then the Rishonim bring in assorted other Gemaras, Tosfos brings in assorted other Gemaras, which we'll also have to consider. So basically, our malacha on this sugya is simply, for now, all I'm trying to do is tidy up the views and tidy up all the disparate sources that we brought, and just try and understand, according to each Rishon, how they're translated. Hopefully, out of that, we'll begin emerging svaros as to what's really going on, but my core labor here is just to work through. We're going to learn through, as I mentioned last time, the Rashba, the Tosfos Rosh, and the Tosfos. I mentioned the last year, in many ways, I regretted printing the Ramban, not because the Ramban doesn't deserve to be learned, he does, but because it's very difficult, Ramban, and the Rashba in a sense simplifies it and just draws out the salient features. It's just an easier way to approach from the same angle. But basically, in terms of the structure of the Sugya, you have a Ramban, Rashba, Ritva, and so I printed the run. Well, I didn't print the run. Okay, the Ramban, Rashba, and Ritva, who are all one family of approach. You have Rashi, who's a second approach, and you have Tosfos, who's a third approach, and Tosfos Rosh, who's maybe even a fourth approach in this. But what we're going to focus on is learning the Rashba, because he's a neat summary of that school of thought, Tosfos, Tosfos Rosh, and Rashi, and just try and understand how they put all these sources together. That's our sort of our roads of the next probably couple of weeks or something. Sorry, Gary.
Are you taking a look at these very delicate specialist things that you would let someone touch? Was your starting point the reason for that is that their purpose is any sort? Because I had thought that the supply, even when their purpose wasn't that sort, was just very fresh, presumably I tomorrow last night.
Okay, so this is a superb question actually. I'm being deliberately vague about exactly what Muktza means, because we'll get up to it. So for now, I'm saying in a way that I'm picking low-hanging fruits just to make life simple. And I'm saying that if you have a Keli Shemelachto LeIssur, the reason for Rabba's allowance of it is because even though it's primarily set aside for Issa, it's a Keli, and therefore if I choose to use it for Heta, why not? It's Mukhan for all use, as opposed to Keli Shemelachto LeIssur, which I wouldn't use for anything else because its use is contradicted by any other use, in which case it's not omitted for any other use, and therefore everyone would agree it's Muktza. So I'm leaving it no more detailed than that deliberately. What you're asking is a very profound and good question, which is, does the concept of Keli Shemelachto, does Muktza make sense with a Keli that's not a Keli Shemelachto LeIssur, and so on, we'll discuss that, and we'll try and fine tune. By the way, even though I'm calling, let's say, the Mesa HaGodol, the great peg, or the Yosed, the great sword, the Yosed Shemachresha, the plow thing, I'm calling it sort of Muktza. It's not a particularly delicate artifact. In that case, it wouldn't be used for anything else because it's too big and clumsy and heavy, and therefore it's not omitted for any other use, perhaps, or perhaps because it's easily damaged. So the point isn't really why I wouldn't use it for anything else. It's just that according to Rabbah, by default, a Keli is a Keli is a Keli. It's omitted for any use, but there are certain specific Kelim which aren't omitted for repurposing, and therefore would indeed be Muktza, even according to Rabbah. So that's those are the three sources that we need to have a look at. Now, in the last year, we learnt, I can't remember how far we got, but we basically learnt through the Rashba, and the Rashba makes many important points, but for our purposes, several things that I want to highlight. The first thing is, he says that the Mishnah that says Kol HaKelim Nitolin L'Tzorech V'Shelo L'Tzorech, Rav Yehuda would explain it as all Kelim which are Keli Shemelachto LeHeta. So again, basically, just to put that differently, the Mishnah on Kuf Chaf Daled Omud Aleph, which says, which was the third Mishnah I said we need to look at, Kol HaKelim Nitolin. That Mishnah, according to the Rashba, I'm just reading to the Rashba here in source 3. According to the Rashba, has to be the Tzorech, has to be, according to Rav Yehuda, the Rashba says, it has to be by Keli Shemelachto LeHeta. And the translation of the Tzorech and Lo Tzorech is the Tzorech means the Tzorech Gufon, and Shelo Tzorech means the Tzorech Mekomam. So basically, a Keli Shemelachto LeHeta, Rav Yehuda holds can be used L'Tzorech Gufay and L'Tzorech Mekomay. L'Tzorech Gufay is called L'Tzorech because it's for its own use, and L'Tzorech Mekomay is called Shelo L'Tzorech because I don't need the Keli, I just need the place which the Keli inhabits, and therefore that's called Shelo L'Tzorech. That's the first point of the Rashba. So that's how we resolve the Mishnah in Kuf Chaf Daled Omud Aleph. How do we resolve Rav Yossi on Kuf Chaf Gimel on base? So the Rashba says that Rav Yehuda says Rav Yossi's arguing on the Tanakama. In other words, the Rashba reads it in a sense like one Mishnah. You have a Tanakama who says position A, and Rav Yossi says position B, like is a familiar pattern in Mishnayos. So Rav Yossi says all Kelim, even those which are melachot LeIssur, can be moved, besides the Mesa Godol and the Yosed Shel Machreisha. And Rav Yehuda and the Tanakama argues on it according to Rav Yehuda. Now, at this point in the Rashba, I don't really know what drives Rav Yehuda to say this. Once he acknowledges it's a machlokas tanoim, and he agrees that Rav Yossi doesn't agree with this stance, where does he get from that the Tanna Kamma argues? Maybe the Tanna Kamma also just means like Rav Yossi, and there's no machlokas over here, particularly because he's forced to sort of be madchel in the Mishnah. There's a little bit of a doichik in the Mishnah because he's forced to squeeze the Mishnah into one interpretation. But either way, this is how the Rashba lands it. The third point I want to focus on what the Rashba says is that there is a sort of problem in our Mishnah, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, all the Mishnah really says is that a Keli Shemelachto leheter can be used for its purpose. I mean, obviously, what's the chiddush in that? So the Rashba says the chiddush isn't in that. The chiddush is in the diuk of that. A Keli Shemelachto leheter can be used to crack nuts, but a Keli Shemelachto le'issur can't be used to crack nuts. And the Rashba, that's what the Rashba says. And the Rashba says that's the reason why it doesn't mention anything about the Tzorech Makomo. It's true that the Tzorech Makomo is also mutter, which is a bigger chiddush, but there was the Mishnah was never coming to tell us the het of Keli Shemelachto leheter. It's coming to tell us the implication of Keli Shemelachto le'issur, what the status of Keli Shemelachto le'issur is, and therefore it didn't mention the other chiddush, which is a bigger chiddush, that Keli Shemelachto leheter can be used for Tzorech Makomo, and therefore later on it ties that up in the Mishnah Kuf Chaf Daled Amud Aleph, in which it makes it explicit that Keli Shemelachto leheter isn't just allowed to be used for Tzorech Gufo, but it's also allowed to be used for Tzorech Makomo. But in brief, whether that maths of what I just said is clear or unclear, the core point I'm bringing out for the Rashba is that the chiddush of the Mishnah was never going to be Keli Shemelachto leheter is allowed to use for Tzorech leheter. That's obvious. The whole chiddush was the implication, but not Keli Shemelachto le'issur. That's the third argument I want to highlight in the Rashba. Okay, so that's the points I want to bring out in the Rashba.
How is the Tzorech stronger than actual use of them? One would think it might be the other way around.
No, it is the other way around. The Tzorech Makomo is more of a chiddush that it's allowed. That's the Rashba's question.
Why is it more of a chiddush? Because surely the chiddush is can you use something?
But the Issa Muktza is an Issa Natila, is an Issa not just to use but to take.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a machlokas about using a Keli, that's Muktza, if it doesn't involve taking it. So, for example, if I have a Muktza table, however we'd get that scenario, let's say bosses or something like that, does that mean I can't eat off the table? So the Issa Muktza is primarily a taking Issa. Now, if I take a Keli Shemelachto leheter for heter use, that's more obviously allowed than taking it for the Tzorech Makomo, which isn't using the Keli at all. Therefore, the Rashba asks, why didn't the Mishnah tell us the bigger chiddush? And the Rashba's answer is because the Mishnah was never coming to tell us Aterim, it was coming to tell us Isurim by implication. The real purpose of saying Keli Shemelachto leheter is allowed is really to say that Keli Shemelachto leheter is allowed, but Keli Shemelachto le'issur isn't allowed. That's the Rashba's reading of the Mishnah. Yeah. Okay. So that's really what I wanted to highlight for now in the Rashba. We didn't learn the second half of the Rashba. Once we've seen Tosfos, maybe we'll get back to the second half of the Rashba. But that's the highlighted features from the first half of the Rashba. Tosfos Rosh, which I now want to have a look at, doesn't go with the Rashba, and I'll just say the Tosfos Rosh outside, and then we'll have a brief look at it inside. Tosfos Rosh is bothered, seemingly, by the same question. Well, it's actually a different question to Rashba, but the same question as we've highlighted, which is what's the chiddush of saying that Keli Shemelachto leheter can be used for heter use? Obviously, I mean, Keli Shemelachto leheter, of course. A nut hammer, of course, can be used for cracking nuts. Like, why on earth not? What would be the problem with that? So he says we're talking about a blacksmith's hammer, which I choose to set aside to use for cracking Egozim, and that's what the Mishnah is referring to. Rav Yehuda's chiddush is not just a genuine nut hammer, but even a blacksmith's hammer, if I meyachid it for Ego's cracking, would become a Keli Shemelachto leheter and therefore be allowed. Now, what's the mechanism of that? The answer is the whole lomdus of Muktza is that I can't change functionality on Shabbos. Once something is set aside for a particular functionality, that's it. That's what it's fixed for. And therefore, a blacksmith's hammer, according to Rabbi Yehuda, can't be repurposed or used on Shabbos for cracking Egozim. Rabbi argues, and he says that's not called repurposing. It was always omed as a kli. It was always omed for all uses. But Rabbi Yehuda argues, however, if before Shabbos I set it aside and repurposed it to be used for nut cracking, so I have in my cutlery drawer a nail hammer, maybe a modern scenario of this, which is because I know I love coconuts and therefore I always want a hammer around. So I've repurposed it as a, in the honor of Zuma, right? So Tu B'Shvat tonight, I've repurposed it as a coconut cracker. That wouldn't be Muktza because it's now become a Keli Shemelachto Heta, and that's the Chiddush of Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, the continuation of the Mishnah, when the Mishnah asks from other things, the nature of the question is these are things which people don't repurpose. No one repurposes a pitchfork for a child feeding implement, and therefore this is ridiculous. You don't repurpose these things, and that's the Rabba's question on Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yehuda's chiddush is that you can repurpose things with yichud. Again, I'm not going. This is beyond the scope of our discussion now, but there's a whole halachic discussion about how you repurpose things and to what manner. So, can you repurpose things with thought alone, or can you even repurpose things with machshava alone, or only with action? Can you rewrite all the halachas of Muktza by repurposing things? What happens if someone before Shabbat says, I want to repurpose all the implements in the house that they should only be used for mutar uses, and that way I solve all the problems of Muktza? Obviously, that's meaningless, that's ridiculous, because I'm still planning to use my pen primarily for writing. So exactly what does repurposing mean, and how does it work? Is an interesting question. I'm tempted to tell you something. I'm not sure whether to say it or not. I'll just say it. Maybe. Go on, yeah. Discussion around. Maybe I'll just pause the recording briefly. Okay, but the more now that we're back online, the more there's a serious question over here about exactly how are you miyachid, whether large or small stones for these things. So that's a halacha discussion. I think actually I did print I printed at the end for those that are interested. Whether we go through it or not, we'll see. Source 6, 7, and 8 is a little bit around yichud and how that works. But anyway, that's the Tosfos Rosh. That's the Tosfos Rosh's answer to the chiddush of the Mishnah. So we now have two answers basically. The Rashba who says that they both are misquoting both of them because neither asked the question explicitly, but implicit in both of them is the question: what's the purpose of the statement that Kurnos, Shel, Egozim can be used to crack Egozim? Obviously, and the Rashba's answer is the purpose was never to teach me that I can use Kurnos, Shel, Egozim. The purpose was to teach me, but I can't use other forms of Kurnos. I can use a Keli Shemelachto Heta, but not a Keli Shemelachto LeIssur. And so Rashba's answer is it's teaching me something about Yichud Kelim. The Kurnos, Shel, Egozim means a regular Kurnos, which is repurposed for that, and you can be miyachid something for a non-Muktza hishtamshus. Now we have the second part of the Tosfos Rosh. In a few minutes we'll read the Tosfos Rosh inside, who is bothered by the same question of how do you learn the Mishnah in Kuf Kaf Gimel Amud Beis, the second Mishnah I said we should have a look at, which Rabbi Yossi says Kol HaKelim Nitolin Chutz Min HaMes HaGadol, etc. So what does Rabbi Yossi's statement of Kol HaKelim Nitolin mean? So I remind you again that the Rashba answered that Rabbi Yehuda was only coming to explain the Tana Kama, but he agrees that the Rabbi Yossi disagrees, right? So he agrees that Rabbi Yossi doesn't fit in accordance with that. In the Tosfos Rosh, he gives a different answer, and he says, consistent with his previous view, Kol HaKelim Nitolin means all kelim can be moved on Shabbos as long as you repurpose them, because you can be re-miyached any keli. So what the Tosfos Rosh has achieved by his reading is that all kelim have the potential to be repurposed through yichud in machshava. In order to put this more subtly, and I want to bring out a serious point actually, also by analogy to stones that we just mentioned before. A stone is not a keli. So a stone you may not be able to repurpose to be miyachid for a functionality unless you do some sort of action that makes it into a keli. However, all kelim are kelim ultimately. So even though Rabbi Yehuda argues with Rabbah and says that a Keli Shemelachto LeIssur can't be used on Shabbos or repurposed on Shabbos for use for a mutar tashmish because it was set aside for an issur use, not a heta use, he agrees that they have enough keli potential in them to be used for any to be re-designated for any use, and therefore all kelim can be repurposed such that they won't be mutar on Shabbos. So translation of Rabbi Yossi, Kol HaKelim, so that they'll be mutar on Shabbos. The translation of Rabbi Yossi, Kol HaKelim Nitolim b'Shabbos, is any keli, if you repurpose it before Shabbos to a mutar use, can be used on Shabbos, and therefore it loses its shame as a Keli Shemelachto LeIssur. Besides the Mesa HaGadol and the Yosef Shemachresha, where yichud wouldn't help because these are such tightly defined kelim that you wouldn't normally repurpose them, and therefore just a thought to be miyachid them wouldn't work. So this is the second point of the Tosfos Rosh. And I want to emphasize that as so often occurs in sugyas, but by the time we finish learning the sugya, we should realize that even though there's significant arguments about all sorts of things, everyone is in the same topic. Everyone is debating the same topic. And what we're looking at is, I want to emphasize this again, what we're looking at is a Keli. A Keli is a utensil. It's a vehicle for me to do the things that I want to do. It may be related etymologically to the word yachol, to be able. It's an enabler. That's what a Keli is. So all Kelim are there to serve me. The question is, how specific and narrow is a Keli's use? So Rabbi Yehuda says, if it's dedicated to be a blacksmith's hammer, it's not made for any other use, and therefore I can't on Shabbos use it to crack nuts. The Rabbi argues on him, and Rabbi says, no, it's a Keli, it's a Keli, it's a Keli, and therefore, even though its default setting in a sense is to be a Kli Shemelachto LeIssur, and I can't move it for no reason, I can use it for how to use. The Tosfos Rosh comes along and says, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees in a limited way that I can choose, if I'm miyachid it, all I have to do is be miyachid it before Shabbos for mutter use, and therefore I can repurpose it, because ultimately it's a Keli. So I don't go as far as Rabbi and think it's automatically only made for any use, but I do agree that if you decide to repurpose it, you can repurpose it for anything else. It always has the potential, the potentiality to use for anything else. In modern Hebrew, I mean, the Rishonim read the yecholiyot, the potential to be used for something, the enabling potential to be used. So that, and therefore this is how the Tosfos Rosh learns the sugya. In a moment, I just want to see the Tosfos Rosh inside. So these are the two pathways that we've learned.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you're miyachid something, are you transforming a Kli Shemelachto LeIssur into a Kli Shemelachto LeHeter, or is it still a Kli Shemelachto LeIssur, but it's now, I don't know, you've invoked a new halachic category that allows it to then be used? Or is that question meaningless because it doesn't have any hafkamina? I just want to...
You're saying when you repurpose a Keli, does it become a Kli Shemelachto LeHeter, or is it still a Kli Shemelachto LeIssur with an allowance in it?
Yes.
Not entirely clear cut. The simplest understanding to avoid proliferating ever more categories would be say, if I'm miyachid it to be a Kli Shemelachto LeHeter, so now it becomes a Kli Shemelachto LeHeter, nothing else to talk about. We might see later, if we have time, that actually this is a machlokas, and maybe even one that has impact halacha l'maisa. In other words, maybe according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's some sort of middle category of it's fundamentally Kli Shemelachto LeIssur, but I've repurposed it somewhat to some degree. But for now, we're just saying if it's repurposed, maybe it becomes a Kli Shemelachto. I mean, there's no Gezerah Sakos of a chok that says a hammer has to be used for nails. If I put this hammer in my cutlery drawer and I use it for cracking coconuts, and then it's now a piece of cutlery according to this idea. Okay, so this is the view of the Tosfos Rosh. Maybe let's just learn the Tosfos Rosh inside, just because I was asked to do these Rishonim inside, and they are all a little tricky. This is on page 2, source 4. Rav Yehuda, Kurnos Shel Egozim lefatri Egozim. So the first point the Tosfos Rosh makes is Hirsch Kurnos Shel Nafochim. This is the Kurnos Shel Nafochim sheyichtu lifto Egozim, that you'd set aside to crack Egozim with. Kamash Ramon is teaching us the Kli Shemelachto LeIssur al yedei yichud menachas heter mystery. A Kli Shemelachto LeIssur, through dedicating it for menachas heter, becomes mutter. So again, this language just brings out your point, is it that now it's a Kli Shemelachto LeHeter, it's a Kli Shemelachto LeIssur. Yeah. The Kulam Maslis and the Sharia Kardim Bereches or Malgez or Kush the Karka Mokula of Yehuda B'Shiachta Menachas Heter. So here the Tosfos Rosh makes a second point, which I didn't mention before, that Rabbi asks a question on Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, what do you do with the sefer of the Mishnah? No one repurposes malgaze for cotton. What did Rabbi Yehuda do that? I mean, he also knew the end of the Mishnah. He would say, yeah, they do. No, I think it's talking about a case where they do. So it's a weakness in Rabbi Yehuda because it's becoming ever more weird that people would be miyachid this Kli Shemelachto LeHeter for this use. But that's how Rabbi Yehuda reads the Mishnah. That the chiddush of the Mishnah is that you can be miyachid even strange yichudim for kelim if that's indeed how you wish to live your life. You know, for some reason or other, you run out of your plastic bowl that you used to feed your kids. Has disappeared. So before Shabbos, you say, okay, we're going to use the spade for that. So, fine, if that's what you do, that's Rabbi Yehuda's point there in Halacha. That's a perfectly reasonable yichud, and it would work. Then, so that's the first 2 points he makes. Number one, that the chiddush of Rabbi Yehuda is yichud. Second point is that he would indeed read the rest of the Mishnah like that, and Tosfos makes that second point in a similar way. And the third point he makes is v'chein ha'datlan kol hakelim l'tolim chutz min ha'mesa ha'gadol. So this is the Mishnah of Rav Yossi. This is the Mishnah in Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Beis. So he says, it's talking about Yichton and Melachas Heter. So he says explicitly, this is Chasar and Kiss. He says these are weak things which get ruined by easy use. I think Rashi says the same thing over there, and therefore this is Kli Shemelachto. This is Chasar and Kiss, which you can't repurpose. And Pshat and Rabbi Yossi is Kol HaKelim Netolin. All kelim can be removed from the category of Muktza by being miyachid them for a heter use. That's how he learns the Mishnah in Rabbi Yossi in Kuf Chaf Gimel on base. In which case, Rabbi Yehuda, the Tanakhama of Rabbi Yehuda, doesn't argue with Rav Yossi, unlike the Rashba, who says that the Tanakhama of Yehuda argues with Rav Yossi. Okay, so this is the Tosfos Rosh. I'll just one point before we. I'll make one final point, given that we've only got a couple of minutes left, and then next year we'll start learning Tosfos in more depth. Tosfos really gives a third possible answer to this question, even though he doesn't quite spell it out like that, because in the maskana of Tosfos brings other Gemaras. So Tosfos brings far away sukkahs. He doesn't just go to our direct sukkahs over here. He brings all sorts of other sukkahs to try and understand Rav Yehuda's view. But the bottom line of Tosfos is he comes to the conclusion that Rav Yehuda agrees that that even a Kli Shemelachto LeIssur can be used for heter tashmishim, as long as these are significant uses, not gerua, inferior uses, whatever that means. In other words, again, Tosfos is learning that the gulf between Rav Yehuda and Rabbi is not as wide as we thought. Everyone agrees that a Kli Shemelachto LeIssur is a Keli, and therefore it's only made for all sorts of uses, and therefore it's not muktza with respect to other uses. However, if the use is something very far-fetched or very gerua or very insignificant, it wouldn't be omitted for that, and that's Rav Yehuda's point. But where it's a significant use, therefore it wouldn't apply. Now, in that reading of Tosfos, all I'll point out for now, given that we've got one minute left, is that would give us another way of being the Yashiv, the mission of Kuf Chaf Gimel on base. Rabbi Yossi, Mekolam Kelim Netolin, all kelim can be moved. The answer is Kol Kelim Netolin for a purpose, for a proper need. Obviously, they can't be used for an insignificant need, but for a proper need, they could be used. That would be the third answer to the question in line with Tosfos. But in next year, we're going to learn Tosfos in Mitzvah Hashem properly and thoroughly, and also we'll learn the continuation of the Rashba, in the second half of the Rashba. But for now, we'll stop there.
Thanks.
Good day.
Go ahead. Thank you.